Section 23 of Count Luckner, the Sea Devil, by Lowell Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Let's Go Raiding Again. My subjects somehow managed to get along on terms of general amity. Our American prisoners took no exception to my mandates handed on to them by Ludeman, my prime minister. They said that, since they had been treated so well aboard the Seattle, they wanted no other command over our colony. The two captains and their lady had made mutually satisfactory arrangements among themselves, and so far as we knew, there was no unpleasant incident, although, for the purposes of my tale, it would have helped a lot if they had fought a duel with swords or coconuts or chunks of jagged coral on the shore of our tropic lagoon. The three Kanakas proved to be thoroughly good fellows and helped us in many ways. We got along with them in pidgin English at first, until one of them picked up a little German. In the middle of the camp, we made a sort of plaza. The Seattle's batteries furnished electric light for it, and there we gathered every night. We still had plenty of champagne and cognac left from the capture of the champagne ship. So, in the cool of the evening, we sat out there on the edge of this equatorial Potsdamer Platz, sipping drinks out of wine and brandy glasses, just as we might have at the Adlon in Berlin. There was plenty of pipe tobacco, and Dr. Peach had taken care to rescue from the wreck a store of his endless cigars. The wind blew, the stars shone, and the orchestra alternately played German classics from the operas and American ragtime melodies. Ah, yes, this last bit of the once glorious overseas German Empire wasn't such a bad little paradise at all. We castaways out there in the solitude of the South Seas felt as though we were the only people left in the world, like Noah and his family on Mount Ararat. But after about 3 weeks of this Garden of Eden without an Eve existence, the monotony of it began to get on our nerves. Of course, there was the wife of the officer of the blank, but she was far too busy to be interested in the rest of us. We hadn't been sent out to colonize the South Seas and take life easy, so we cast about for a way to go buccaneering again. Our first need was for a ship to take the place of our unfortunate three-master, impaled out there on the coral reef. The Kanakas told us that a French sailing vessel visited the island every year to take away turtle meat. The best guess that they could make was that it would be another 6 months or so before she arrived. Well, after 6 months, we would have a ship. We could always fall back on that. But, by Joe, 6 months was a long time to wait. The war might be won or lost by then, and it was highly unlikely that any other ship would stray into those waters for heaven knows how long. We all grew impatient. Few sailors are keen about remaining cast away on a tropical isle for long, and especially on an atoll as small as Mopalia. We felt the itch to get out to sea again. I was particularly anxious to set something stirring. Before long, the tropical sun and lazy life would sap my men's vitality, and all they would be good for would be to loll around. We still had our lifeboats, and the hurricane season was not on, so why not put to sea in one of them? We devised rigging and sails for our best lifeboat: mast, jib boom, main boom, gaff, stays, and backstays. We scraped, caulked, and painted her. She was not in any too good condition, and despite our labor, she continued to leak a bit and needed constant bailing. Even in calm weather, we had to bail 40 pails a day. We loaded her with provisions for 6 men over a long voyage. She was 18 feet in length and only about 14 inches above water amidship. Into this small space we stored water, hardtack, machine guns, rifles, hand grenades, and pistols. The only luxuries we allowed ourselves were a few tins of pemmican, a side of bacon, and an accordion. The music of the squealer was to be our solace during a cruise the length of which none could foretell. The great question was, could our tiny craft survive a storm? At any rate, she could sail, and that was something. We christened her the Grande Princesse Cécilie, without, however, painting her name on the stern. Of course, everybody wanted to go, but there could be only 6 of us at the most, so I picked the men who seemed to be in the most vigorous health at the time: Mate Ludeman, Lieutenant Kirches, Engineer Kraus, Bosun Parmian, and Yeoman Erdmann. This left the colony on the atoll in the hands of Lieutenant Kling. Our overloaded cockleshell, with a crew of 6, was the smallest auxiliary cruiser in the war. For cruiser we were, and we were setting out to capture a ship, sail back to Mopalia, pick up our comrades there, and continue our raid. To find and take a ship on the high sea was a doubtful proposition, but we might get to some of the other islands not too well populated and guarded, and find a vessel at anchor. We could board her at night, overpower the captain and crew, and sail off with her. We planned first of all to visit the Cook Islands, some 800 miles distant, and if we found no ship there, continue on another 1,000 miles farther to the Fiji Islands, where there were sure to be ships loading with copra for the ammunition factories of Europe. We figured on making around 60 nautical miles a day, so that if we had to go all the way to the Fijis, it would take us approximately 30 days. Thus, we should be back with a ship in 3 months at most. We discussed our tactics thoroughly for the expected capture. We would steal aboard. 3:30 in the morning was the best hour. Men sleep their soundest then. A couple of us would go to the officers' cabins, the rest to the forecastle. We would show our pistols, disarm them, and herd them below. It would be good to sneak to their clothing first and take away their belts and snip the buttons off their trousers. Then, when you have them put on their clothes, they stand without belts, suspenders, or buttons holding up their trousers. Thus, they are helpless. We had a few bombs loaded only with powder, harmless, but capable of making a terrific noise. If there is any trouble, you throw one. It hurts nobody, but the terrible explosion creates a general panic. A couple of men with their heads about them can do wonders with dozens in a panic. Another good thing is to have a couple of fellows outside shout suddenly and make a great disturbance. That creates excitement and throws people off their guard. I said to my bosun, "Don't hurt anybody unless you have to. We don't want to spoil our clean record by killing anybody. But, by Joe, if a captain or a watchman raises a rifle or a pistol, don't wait till he shoots. Get him first." On a bright summer morning, August 23rd, 1917 to be exact, we all shook hands. There was no cheering, merely quiet, earnest words of friendship and good luck. It was the first time that we 64 seamen had parted since the Seattle had set sail to run the blockade 8 months before, and it was only now, at the moment of saying goodbye, that we realized how closely attached to one another we had become. We who were going could see a brooding question in the eyes of those who were staying behind. How will that overloaded cockleshell stand heavy weather? Never mind, we would probably find out soon enough. The understanding was that if we did not return in 3 months, something had happened to us. They should wait for us until then. Afterward, Kling and his men were to get away from the atoll as best they could. We sailed out of the lagoon, through the coral entrance, into the open sea. The hulk of the Seattle lay there helpless on the reef. The tide was high, and the breakers swept over the coral. She was a red-brown now from rust and weathering. Each flooding billow raised her a bit, and then she sank back hopelessly with loud groans and creaks of despair on the coral bed. As we passed her, she seemed to call over to us, "Come aboard. I want to take you on your voyage. Don't desert your old friend." And as a wave raised her, it seemed as though she was struggling to get on an even keel again and come to us, only to find that the coral held her in a relentless grasp. Tears filled our eyes. "Goodbye, Seattle," I called. "Perhaps we shall never see you more. And even if we do, you can never sail again. Never more will songs resound on your decks. Never more will you raise your sails and fly a flag from your masts." A brisk wind carried us westward with a swelling of our sails. The happy island receded. The last German colony and the wreck of the Seattle slowly dropped out of sight over the rim of the horizon. Today, the Seattle still remains on the reef at Mopalia. After we had gone, Lieutenant Kling, afraid that the stumps of her mast might attract a passing warship, blew them out with dynamite. The explosion set a fire that burned away part of the woodwork. A quantity of ammunition still aboard blew up and cracked the forepart of the hulk. Afterward, when the Seattle's history became generally known, the Harris Irby Cotton Company of New York, which had originally owned the ship as the Pass of Balmaha, investigated the possibilities of salvaging the ship. A party of engineers was sent to Mopilia. They reported that the ship was unsalvageable. In my cruise around the world aboard the Vaterland, I shall stop at the island and survey what once was my tropical domain. And again I shall board the old Seattle on which we sailed and raided. So, until then, old ship, auf Wiedersehen. End of Chapter 25. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 24 of Count Luckner, the Sea Devil, by Lowell Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. From the Society Islands to the Cook Islands in an open boat. It has been something of a sport of recent years to cross the Atlantic and even the Pacific in a small boat, sometimes under sail and sometimes under motor power. Tiny craft have done it, and at best it is not a comfortable kind of voyage. In sporting events, your ocean-going small boat always had a cabin, or an imitation of one. That is what we should have had, but we were not so lucky, and, besides, the load we carried made existence aboard our lifeboat that had been converted into a cruiser a cramped affair indeed. There was only one place we could trust to be dry, the buoyant air tanks at the sides of the boat. In these we packed our hardtack, a few pieces of clothing, photographic apparatus, and the all-important tobacco. It affected the buoyancy of our craft, but we had to keep some things away from the seawater. In the body of the boat were placed the water tanks, our large supply of weapons and ammunition, cordage for the rigging, and several spare sails. Canvas shields at the side, which could be drawn over at the top and be made to form some kind of tent, sheltered us somewhat from waves and dirty weather. Without these, we should have been practically drowned. 4 mattresses could be stretched on the bottom, where 4 men could sleep while 2 kept watch. As a concession to civilization, we had 6 pairs of knives and forks, 6 mugs, a coffee pot, and $5,000 in silver, gold, and paper, much of it in pounds sterling. At 6 in the morning, the 2 men on watch filled the coffee pot and applied fire to it from a soldering lamp. With the slightest breeze and a rocking of the boat, it was impossible to bring the water to a boil. Then we were glad to get tepid coffee bean soup instead of coffee. After toilets had been made with salty seawater, we squatted in the cockpit for breakfast of coffee and hardtack. Navigation was difficult in so small a boat. It was impossible to spread the charts out properly, and with the slightest carelessness, the wind might take our priceless navigation papers overboard. We had to use the sextant and other navigation instruments in a boat that often pitched so much we could scarcely stand. The papers, charts, tables, logarithms, and so on got sopping wet, and when we dried them in the sun, they grew swollen and difficult to handle. It was cool at night, but not unpleasant so long as our clothes were dry. The weather was fair, but an occasional whale would come alongside and douse us with a spray of his spout. Then, in our damp clothing, we felt the chill of the night. The days were broiling hot, but even while taking advantage of what little shade we had, we grew heavy and torpid. We had, above all things, to be careful of our water supply. We never dared drink enough to quench our thirst completely, and were, in fact, continually thirsty. By way of amusement, we had readings aloud from the one book we had brought along, Fritz Reuter's comic story, A Trip to Constantinople, and at night the squealer wheezed and blared, and we whiled away the tedious hours singing old German folk songs. After 3 days, we sighted Attu, the first island of the Cook group and a British possession. There was no ship in sight. Too bad, but perhaps a ship might be expected soon. Anyway, we had to make port and get fresh food. Aside from the danger of storm, if our voyage continued for any length, we feared most of all beriberi and scurvy, which our diet of hardtack would inevitably bring upon us unless we varied it with fresh vegetables. A crowd of natives, fine-looking Polynesians, watched curiously as our little craft drew up to the dock. Kierheist and I went ashore and straight to the house of the British resident. He lay stretched out in his shirt and trousers on a Borneo long chair on his porch and didn't even get up when we approached. He was a good-looking fellow, but lazy as the devil. The lassitude of the South Seas had certainly got him. "My name is Van Houten," I began, "and this is my chief officer, Southard." The resident looked at me suspiciously. It was a true British mistrust. Ordinarily, your Englishman is the best of fellows, a pleasant chap to meet, a perfect host, but in wartime you had to admire them. They were on the lookout for everything. Their brains seemed made only of suspicions. Kierheist, who spoke English better than I did, continued, "We are Americans of Dutch birth. A few months ago we made a bet at the Holland Club in San Francisco that we would sail from Honolulu in an open boat via the Cook Islands to Tahiti and back to Honolulu. The wager is for $25,000. Would you, my dear sir, kindly give me a certificate that we have been here in accordance with the terms of our bet? Also, we should like to lay in a supply of fresh water, canned goods, and fresh fruit." The resident yawned, looked us over with a watery eye, and replied, "Well, a man must be a hell of a fool to go in for that kind of sport." "Sure," Kierheist said politely, "but just the same, we should like to have the certificate. Won't you give it to us or tell us who will?" "Oh, to hell with you. Don't bother me. I've just had dinner and want to take my nap." Even his British mistrust, with which he first regarded us, subsided into the indescribable something that comes over a white man who yields to the soft enervation of the tropics. He now looked at us merely as mad fellows who wanted him to do something too crazy to merit his consideration. "Any news from the bloody war?" he asked. "Why are they so stupid as to carry on with this fighting business? In the end, it will only help these yellow races." He continued like this and spoke highly of the Germans. Naturally, we did not express any pro-German sentiments. "We simply must get this old bird to give us that certificate," I said to my comrade in Low German, pretending that it was Dutch. "Yes," he replied in the same dialect, "it may come in mighty useful later on." The resident, as he told us, had served in the Boer War and should have known better, but he took our Plattdeutsch for the language of Holland. Presently he scribbled a note saying that we had called on him in the course of our sporting cruise. "Any ships expected in port soon?" Kierheist asked quite casually. "How in hell do I know?" the resident responded wearily. "Everything goes to the bloody war, and we don't see anything around here but these Kanakas." He continued in this strain and cursed his boredom on the island. The resident was still rambling on in his lazy monotone when along came a man who wore a cassock and had a beard down to his waist. He was a French missionary priest who was overjoyed when we saluted him with a few words of French. The resident and an English trader were the only two white men on the island besides himself, and neither talked any French. "Allons, allons," he shouted. "By Jove, boys, you must pay me a visit." And straightway he seized our arms and took us over to his mission house. There he poured out glasses of excellent wine. "You are Americans," he cried. "You fight for La France? You are Hollanders? Ah, it is too bad that your country is not in the war with France, but I can see that you love La Belle France." With that, he put on the gramophone a record of La Marseillaise and had us sing it along with him, which we did with all our lungs. Since it had been written and dedicated to my great-grandfather, I didn't mind a bit. He chattered in French incessantly, in an ecstasy over having someone with whom he could talk his native tongue. He embraced us a dozen times and made us sit down to dinner. It was an excellent meal. The wine was particularly good. The conversation made us squirm a little. The good father was the best fellow possible, but patriotic to the very fingertips. He treated us to some choice denunciations of the Germans. After another rendition of the Marseillaise, we took our leave. "What will be your next stop?" asked the jovial missionary in parting. "I think we will put in at Aitutaki," I replied. That was the nearest island and the next field of action in our hunt for a ship. "Fine," exclaimed the priest cordially. "I have a friend there. You must call on him. Just mention my name. He will be delighted to see you. He is a Hollander, too." A Hollander, too? And our knowledge of the Dutch language was so strongly salted with a German accent. In that case, when we got to Aitutaki, we certainly would be anything but Hollanders, probably Norwegians. Everywhere on the island were trees and fruits, coconuts, bananas, mangoes, and oranges. On the streets of the village, with its thatched huts, were South Sea beauties who wore wreaths of flowers and had dark, flashing eyes. They gazed with interest on the foreign sportsman, the story of whose cruise on a bet had spread among the natives. We took aboard what provisions we needed and set sail for Aitutaki. The weather turned miserable, by Joe. It rained every day, those drenching tropical downpours. Our sailcloth covering was not tight enough to hold the water out. The sea was heavy and continually washed into the boat. Often we bailed as many as 250 pails an hour. Everything not stowed in the side tanks got wet. When the rain stopped for a while, the waves and spray kept things from drying. We were soaked to the skin and never did get dry. Our blankets and mattresses were dripping wet. When we lay in the sodden bedding, we were freezing cold and could sleep scarcely at all. Often it was a relief to be called to go on watch. Then at least we could thresh our arms about and get warm. Cooking was almost impossible now, and we seldom ever got coffee anything like hot. Once we saw a waterspout forming right before our eyes. A fine, whirling drizzle close to the water attracted our eyes. It revolved ever more rapidly, seizing wider masses of water. In the sky was a little black thundercloud extending downward in the shape of a funnel. The whirl of spray on the water ran up swiftly. The cone of the thundercloud stretched down to meet it. They came together and united. A roaring and sound of bursting, a tremendous suction of water, and sky and sea were connected by a whirling column. Gyrating and swaying, it moved in our direction. Our boat lay in a calm. Not a breath of air around us. Will this wandering giant strike us and break upon us, deluge and swamp us? Automatically, Ludeman at the rudder tries to steer us. Without wind, our boat cannot move, much less steer. But the roaring monster collapses with a deafening clap. Its mass of water falls upon the sea, and from it a circular swell spreads out. We rock uncomfortably and thank heaven. During our voyages among the islands, we narrowly escaped several similar spouts. After 3 days, we found ourselves steering our way through the maze of reefs, very beautiful but perilous, that extend out in front of the landing place at Aitutaki. Again, there was no ship in sight, but again one might be scheduled to arrive within some reasonable time. That was our hope. A crowd of natives gathered to watch us come in, also 6 white men, among whom was the British resident. He was a tall, lanky fellow who wore glasses and looked a perfect picture of President Wilson. We found this resident to be full of the same British suspicion. Unlike his colleague at Atiu, he was in no wise lost in tropical indolence, but was active and shrewd. We saw that he entertained the liveliest doubts about us. Might we not be wandering Germans? Of course, he could not venture any forcible measures to investigate our case, such as searching our boat, for if we really were Germans, we would doubtless be armed to the teeth, and in that case, where would he be? He had no force to match ours. We tried our level best to quiet his suspicions by our offhand natural behavior. We thought our sporting voyage explanation and our request for a certificate, such as we had got from the resident at Atiu, plausible enough. It was too bad that we could not use the other resident's certificate, but in it were written our supposed Dutch names, and now we were Norwegians. The resident began by saying to us that we would no doubt be delighted to meet a fellow countryman of ours. This countryman turned out to be a Norwegian carpenter. We surmised at once that he had been instructed by the resident to talk with us and see whether we were really Norwegians. My Norwegian was bad, but Kierhuis spoke the language like a native. I kept severely out of the way and let Kierhuis have a long, friendly talk with the carpenter. Kierhuis convinced his man that he was as Norse as the Vikings. The carpenter was delighted to meet a fellow countryman so jovial and, as Kierhuis represented, so wealthy. He promptly reported to the resident that we were the truest Norsemen alive and could in no wise be Germans. The resident, with his inscrutable President Wilson face, invited me to his house for dinner. I accepted. A British merchant named Lowe invited my lieutenant to his house. We suspected it was a dodge to separate us. Seemingly, the Norwegian's assurance had not fully allayed the mistrust of these uneasy Britons. Kierhuis and I made every excuse we could to keep together, but the hospitality was so pressing that we could not refuse any longer without practically giving ourselves away. Even if we are apart, I said to Kierhuis on the side, we have our pistols and hand grenades, by Joe. We will keep our eyes open, and we can take care of ourselves single-handed. If anything looks wrong, we will fight our way to the boat. At the resident's house, a fine stone structure, I had a much-needed bath and shave. When I rejoined him, the resident studied my smooth jaws. "Why," he exclaimed, "you are shaved." "Yes, thanks to you, and I feel 100% better." "But one doesn't shave on a sporting trip, does one?" He did not believe in anything, that Englishman. He was a true skeptic. We dined pleasantly enough. The resident talked a lot, although he did not seem to be naturally a talkative kind. He asked me many questions, which I answered cautiously. A native servant brought him a note, and he scribbled a note in return. After a few minutes, the servant brought him another message, and again he answered it. This happened several times. "Important messages?" I asked. "Oh, no," he replied hastily. "They are from my friend Lowe. He wants to arrange to have us all take coffee at his bungalow." It was very queer. I was prepared, though, and thanked my stars for the pistol and hand grenade in my pockets. I learned later that their scheme was, in fact, to question Kierhuis and me separately. The purpose of the notes was to arrange questions to be asked of us, so that they might check up our separate answers to the same questions. These answers, it happened, had jibed fairly well, although not well enough to disarm suspicion altogether. I thought it an imprudent time to ask when a ship might be expected, and hoped that some voluntary information on the subject might be vouchsafed. None was, however. I resolved to let the subject wait. People suspected of being a boatload of armed Germans might too readily be suspected of being interested in the arrival of ships. When the time for leaving came, the resident told me that, if we would return on the following day, he would give us the certificate we desired, certifying that in the course of our sporting voyage we had called at the island of Aitutaki. The delay about the certificate was, of course, to detain us a day longer. Away from this unsatisfactory interview, we encountered the Norwegian carpenter, who informed Kierhuis that the natives believed we were Germans. The British had been recruiting soldiery among them for service in France, and for the purpose of getting recruits had stirred them up with a bit of war fever. The islanders therefore hoped that we were enemies, so they could seize us. They planned to get our boat ashore and capture it. Upon hearing of this, I ordered that 2 men be on watch all the time, ready to repel any attack. "Any ships expected in port?" Kierhuis asked the carpenter. "There may be one tomorrow," was the reply, "or it may not be here for a month." We held a council of war that night. Should we sail straight on? That would make them certain that we were Germans, but there was no wireless station on the island, and they could not warn the other islands till a ship arrived to take away the news. Or should we capture the island, which we could easily do with our extensive armament, and then wait for a ship? Or should we still try to convince the resident that we were the Norwegian sportsmen we pretended? This latter temporizing measure we adopted and decided to call on the resident the following day and try to get our certificate from him. In preparation for the visit, I instructed the men who remained behind to be ready for trouble ashore. If we needed them, they would hear a pistol shot. They should immediately open fire with machine guns and hand grenades. They should shoot into the air and throw the grenades into the water, where they would make the most noise. The row would create a diversion, and then they should hurry ashore with machine guns, rifles, and grenades to rescue us if need be. The following day provided us with plenty of thrills. When Kierheis and I went to the resident's house, crowds of natives followed us. The resident greeted us with a worried expression, but came straight to the point. "I shall have to examine your boat and papers," he said sternly. "How so?" said I. "The natives think you are Germans. I know you are not, but I must inspect your boat to satisfy them." He vacillated between the desire of not letting us get away and the fear of a fight. Outside, the Polynesians were gathering from all quarters. They made a menacing, ugly-looking mob. Left hand in pocket, I attached a carbine hook to the fuse of the grenade. With that mob of heathens on the rampage, there was no use in trying to carry the deception any further. "It is true," I said to the resident. "We are Germans, but don't you think it would be better if we remained friends? We are white men. I am with you in front of these natives. Act the part that will impress them. Come and examine our boat." "Very well," he replied, growing pale, "but you won't take me with you?" "No, upon my word, no." When we stepped out on the porch, the islanders raised a howl. I never thought there were so many Polynesians in the world. I had never before stood in the face of a mob. Sailors or soldiers would not have made me so afraid. "Don't be a coward," I said to myself. "On, by Joe, on." Kierheis and I stayed close together. The resident led us through the mob, which was overawed by his presence. We were halfway to the boat when a native in colonial uniform stepped up. He had seen service with the British in France, we were afterward told. "Shall I arrest them, sir?" he asked. "Arrest what?" I shouted. "Shut your trap. Why should a fool like you try to arrest Norwegians?" Then I muttered to the resident, "If that fellow makes any fuss, I'll shoot him dead." "Don't talk that way," he replied nervously, and waved the native soldier away. The crowd followed us to the landing. A small rowboat picked us up. "You won't keep me with you?" the resident asked again. I assured him that we would not, so he rowed over and climbed into my boat, impelled less by his own desire than by the attitude of the natives. "Here is the log." Kierheis, with an impassive face, handed him a log we had taken from one of our captured ships. He perfunctorily turned the pages and came upon a chronometric diary we kept in the book. Above was stamped in fat type, "Keiserliche Marine." "What is that?" he stammered. "Something in Norwegian," Kierheis grinned sardonically. "I don't understand it." The resident saw "Gond und Stand." "What language is that?" This time he was a trifle ironical. "Oh, Norwegian, of course," said Kierheis. The resident raised a tarpaulin, but dropped it quickly. He had seen rifles. He raised another. There were neat rows of hand grenades, as easy to pick up as apples. "Keep those covered," he exclaimed, as pale as ashes. "Well," I asked, "how do you find everything?" "Quite all right, quite all right." He smiled a very acid smile. "Won't you tell your people here that everything is all right?" I suggested. He turned to the crowd on the pier. "Everything is in order," he called. "These gentlemen are Norwegian sportsmen, as they say." "And now the certificate," I reminded him. He wrote a note just as the resident at Atiu had done. "You don't intend to take me with you," he repeated. "No," I responded, "but I should like to have your company until we can get some fruit and tobacco." I stood chatting with him on the pier while Kierheis went to procure the fruit and tobacco. Hadn't we better take the island and wait for a ship instead of sailing off? I debated the question with myself and then decided we had better go. The last scene of this little drama was played as the resident and I shook hands and bade each other an apparently cordial farewell. He was a decent fellow, even if he had been suspicious, and I had eaten an excellent dinner at his house. I was glad that we didn't have to humiliate him before the natives, a dreadful fate for an Englishman. As we hoisted anchor and raised sail, a cheer went up from the natives lined along the shore. They were trying to make amends for having treated us so shabbily and for having taken us for Germans. But there at Aitutaki, I had made the great mistake of our cruise. We should have captured that island. 3 days later, a schooner arrived. We could have taken it, rejoined our comrades, and continued our raids. Instead, the resident told the officers the story of our visit. The schooner sailed the next day, and in a little while met a steamer to which it transferred the news about us. The steamer, in turn, radioed a warning to the whole South Seas, so we were now in for a warm welcome. End of Chapter 26. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 25 of Count Luckner, the Sea Devil, by Lowell Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27, Through a Sea of Floating Brimstone to Fiji. At Rarotonga, another island of the Cook group, we had a fright. By Jove, we were scared. It was night. We suddenly saw right before us, in the shadow of the shore, a big steamer. She had no lights. She must be an auxiliary cruiser. Hard on the helm and every stitch of canvas up, we turned and sailed the other way as fast as the wind would carry us. We expected every moment to be spotted by their lookout and then see the ghost-like searchlight beam fingering toward us through the dark. "Our luck is with us," I said to Ludeman, when finally we were far enough out at sea to consider ourselves past danger. Months later, while discussing our adventures with a group of ship's officers, I was told by one of them that the supposed auxiliary cruiser that had frightened us at Rarotonga was really nothing more than a wreck. Several months before our approach to the island, a steamer had gone aground on a reef just offshore and had been abandoned. The position of the wreck was such that at night it might readily be taken for a ship lying at anchor. But we had decided, when we got well away from Rarotonga, that the Cook group of islands was no place for us. At Atiu we had found no ship to capture. At Aitutaki, no ship either, only a lot of trouble, including the misfortune of being recognized as Germans. And now, at Rarotonga, we had nearly sailed into what we supposed to be an auxiliary cruiser in the dark. "By Joe," I said to the boys, "we'd better clear out of here and try our luck in other waters." "Aye, but where? The Fijis?" "The Fijis," I responded. "We'll find plenty of ships there." We had all along figured that we might have to go to the Fiji Islands, where a constant stream of sailing ships was always taking aboard copra for the munition factories in the United States. But we also were fully aware that sailing in a little open boat from the Cook Islands to the Fijis might easily be a perilous venture. Our voyage so far had gone fairly smoothly. There had been no hurricanes, and we thank God for that. Our itinerary from our starting point at Mopilia in the Society group to the adjoining Cook group and among the islands of the latter represented jumps of several hundred miles each and quite a few days at sea. On to the Fijis, however, meant a sail across 20 degrees of longitude. The first half of the jaunt, or about 1,000 miles, was over a vast open space of sea where there were no islands on which to find fresh food or on which to take refuge in case of need. In fact, we were to sail for 13 days out of sight of land. We had expected, when we left Mopilia, that the leg to the Fijis would be a hard one, even if we had fair weather all the way. But now the weather turned against us for a whole week, and we began to think we had run across St. Swithin's Day. We had forgotten, if we had ever known it, that this was the time when the equinoctial storms broke in those waters. Had we known it, we never would have headed for the Fijis. For 10 days we sailed through a drenching downpour, the rainy season. The sea was choppy. The wind whipped the spray and the crests of waves over us in driving sheets. In our cockleshell, things were afloat, and it was bitter cold o' nights. We threw our mattresses overboard. In their soaked condition, they were far worse to sleep on than the wet planks, and there was no use keeping them any longer. When the sun occasionally shone, our drenched clothes would dry quickly and stiffen like boards of salt. They rubbed and scratched the skin off our bodies. When they got wet again, which they promptly did, the salt would soak into the raw flesh and inflame it. Our bodies felt as though they were on fire. We had no regular sleep. Instead, a man would doze away suddenly at almost any time. Even the helmsman would drowse off like that, and, with a free rudder, the boat would veer around crazily. One morning, when dawn came, we could hardly believe our eyes. The sea had turned from its normal blue to yellow. On scooping up a pail of it, we found a scum that we concluded must be brimstone and ash. We were sailing through a field of brimstone. For 3 days we saw from horizon to horizon this yellowish expanse of volcanic dust. It no doubt came from some submarine eruption, perhaps the one we could thank for the tidal wave that had wrecked the Seattle. The waves carried the gritty dust into the boat. It penetrated everything. Every surface became like sandpaper. Our skin grew rough and caked with it. Our blankets were like sandpaper, and so were our clothes. As the voyage grew longer, we had to be more and more sparing with our drinking water. The supply began to run low. We could no longer collect rainwater in our sails. They were coated with salt. We tried to wash them out in the rain, but then the spray and the waves kept washing in and kept the sails salty and added a further salting to any water we collected. Our supply of fruit that we had picked up in the Cook Islands ran out now, and about all we had left was hardtack, not in itself a thirst-quenching kind of food. We also had a side of delicious bacon, but of course we dared not touch it for fear of increasing our thirst. You have often heard of the torments of thirst at sea? Well, they are not exaggerated, for exaggeration is impossible. When the rain stopped and the blazing tropical sun beat down on us all day, and we still had days to sail on, then the torments of the damned, the torments of thirst, smote us with a fiery agony. Our gums dried out and were like rough iron. We sucked our fingers and gnawed at our knuckles to bring a flow of saliva and refresh our burning mouths. And then came the sailor's worst enemy, scurvy. Our diet of hardtack, lack of exercise, and general hardships brought it on. Our knees swelled up so badly that we had to cut our trousers. The rocking of the boat knocked them together or against the wooden sides, and then the pain was almost unendurable. Our lips were black and broken. Our tongues were swollen and hard. It was as if you had a stone in your mouth. Our gums became snow white and seemed to recede. Our teeth felt as though they were sticking far out of our jaws. They hurt constantly and were loose and felt as if they were going to drop out. With these shaking teeth, we ate our hardtack. I never before knew how hard hardtack was. We had unending headaches, and it seemed as if something were pressing our eyes right out of their sockets. We got water in our legs and could hardly stand any more. We had to slide around the seats to do what had to be done in navigating the boat. In scurvy, the blood turns to water, first in the legs and then upward. When it reaches the heart, you die. Where the blood is water, the flesh is white, and you can see the line of the white creep slowly up. We wondered who would be the first to have the line of white rise to the heart. My boys made marks to show the line clearly and mark its daily progress upward. It was a kind of sport. It was keeping a daily log, a log of death. Parmian was the youngest of us, but he seemed to be on his way to win the race. The line was higher on him than on the others. He joked about it. There was nothing terrible in it. We were all in a deep apathy. Our brains were like balls of cotton. Nothing mattered, certainly not death. Death would come, we thought, as a relief from these sufferings. The prospect of its arrival became more and more attractive. "Boys," I said, "let us take pieces of ballast iron and tie them around our necks. One plunge, and in a few seconds all of our pains will be gone." "Yes, all right." There were mutterings of assent. But Parmian, the youngest, the one who was nearest death, picked up the comic volume, Fritz Reuter's Trip to Constantinople, and began to read a funny story. We all laughed. That book had eased many a hard hour before on this ghastly voyage, and now, perhaps, it saved our lives. And so we continued on, with but one instinct left in us, the sailor's instinct to navigate his craft. Mechanically, without any particular hope, without any particular thought, we trimmed the sails, guided the helm, and calculated our position as best we could. Nautical science was at a low ebb among us now. We were too far gone to reckon exactly where we were, and were only vague in our steering. All we knew was that we should steer to the west, where the island groups were. You have read in many a sea story about the delight, the almost insane ecstasy of castaway men adrift in open boats who are dying of hunger, thirst, and disease, when, at last, a rescuing ship approaches or they see land. No matter how the writers describe it, even the greatest of writers, they can tell you only a tiny bit, only a grain of sand. So I won't try to say how we felt when we saw a speck on the horizon, and the speck grew bigger and turned into the familiar green of a tropical island. We had been so much like dead men who had thought that nothing could ever make us glad again. By Jove, that sight gladdened our hearts, though. We grew even weaker, but it was the weakness of happiness. As we drew near, we thought of nothing but land, fresh water, and soft food, a soft banana for our loose, shaky teeth. Never mind ships or capturing ships. Never mind being taken prisoners. We headed straight toward a crude pier that stuck out into the water. A crowd of 100 natives, perhaps less, were gathered at the landing place, watching our approach. They were ferocious-looking black warriors. We had now passed from the region of the brown, indolent Polynesians to those of the black, warlike Melanesians. "What ugly customers," I said to Ludeman. "They look like cannibals." The forbidding battle array on shore stirred a new strength in us. It certainly looked like a cannibal island, and miserable as we were, still we could not escape the thought of our skin and bones being fattened up in preparation for an old-time South Sea banquet. "Clear the boat for action," I ordered. Even in our present straits, we could still remember our old naval ways. The German flag went jerking to our masthead, and rifles and machine guns were displayed. A shout went up on shore, and a babble of talk. Voices yelled in pidgin English. "You Germans? How you get here from way off? Come on, Germans great warriors." Still wary, we drew near the landing pier and talked with the natives. They were unmistakably friendly, very cordial. From what they told us, they had, in the first place, grievances against their masters, the British. Then quite a number had been recruited and sent to the trenches in France. There some had been killed and some wounded, and most who survived had contracted tuberculosis from the unaccustomed climate and had been returned to the island worn-out shells of men. One of their most influential chiefs was particularly concerned about the war. He was on the pier, and he reasoned thus. "White men send missionary. Missionaries say we must not fight. because all men children of God, all men brothers. They say we can have war no more. Then they say we must go fight. They have war. We no fight for ourselves, they say, we fight for them. How, if men are brothers? Our men killed. Our men come back sick with cough. Cough never goes away. These people were of a warrior race. What the British had told them about how bad the Germans were had not made much impression. What stuck in their minds was the fighting power of the Germans. They had heard about it from the British, and those who had been in the trenches of Flanders knew about it firsthand. The sudden appearance of armed Germans at their remote island could but increase their admiration. Morality among them had principally to do with a man's fighting spirit. They said there were no white men on the island, and we longed to go ashore. With our scurvy swollen legs, we could hardly stand, however. It wouldn't do to be hauled ashore as cripples. It would not increase these warriors' respect for Germans as fighting men. Cripples do not fare well among savage peoples, and we thought it best not to reveal our impotence. So we refused the natives' invitations to partake of their hospitality and told them we must hurry on to fight the British and asked for fresh water and bananas. They brought great gourds full of water and bunches of bananas. We drew up to the dock and they handed these precious supplies down for us. We had our fill of bananas and water and, with shouts resounding from the shore, set sail again. This lucky spot was Niue, an outlying isle of the Fiji group. The sun blazed down upon us, but a fair wind carried us along briskly. The first day after leaving Niue, we felt better. The second day, we were on the road to high good health. It is amazing the curative effect of fresh fruit, especially bananas, when you are suffering from scurvy. They seem to put new life and blood into you and draw the sickness right out of the body, as though some huge and marvelous poultice had been applied. Our cure was completed at the Isle of Katafanga. It is quite a large isle and inhabited by more natives, but we hit upon a stretch of shore that seemed permanently deserted. At any rate, we remained there for 5 days and saw not a soul. When we went ashore, we all walked with a comical, staggering gait. You know the characteristic rolling gait of the sailor accustomed to having a deck under his feet? Ours was an exaggeration of it. After 2 weeks in our constantly pitching boat and never a foot on land, we could not get our legs used to solid, unmoving earth. Even after 5 days of extensive pedestrianism on the beach, we rolled along rather than walked. There was plenty of fruit around, and many streams ran down to the sea. We ate enough fruit to expel all the scurvy in the world and bathed luxuriously in the clear water. On the island was a deserted house. We inspected it and saw that it had been owned by a German planter. We afterward learned that, at the outbreak of the war, the planter fled to the interior of the island, and an Englishman had taken possession of his house, then, not liking the island, had left it pretty much to itself. Among the rubbish in the house was a German mercantile magazine, and on the first page that I turned to, I saw an advertisement of the paint firm of Erdmann and Kierhuis. One of our sailors was named Erdmann, and my lieutenant was named Kierhuis. No relations of the paint firm, but we took it as a good omen. At any rate, coming upon the planter's house was certainly good luck. It had gone to seed a bit, but there still were Christian beds in it. For the first time since sailing away from Mopilia, we slept comfortably, and between sheets, too. We were now getting near the larger islands of the Fiji group, where the sailing ships loaded with copra would be encountered. If we did not succeed in capturing a ship here, we never could hope to capture one. We found a handsome little sailboat belonging to the Englishman who had taken over the German's house, but we left her where she lay. She was more comfortable than our battered old lifeboat, but the latter was a last relic of our old Seattle. She had brought us this far, so we wanted to keep her until we had captured a ship. We raised sail, knowing that, for better or for worse, we were on the last leg of our voyage in the lifeboat. We came to the main body of the Fijis and sailed into a large gulf surrounded by distant islands. It was night, and we decided to wait till morning to see how many ships were passing and what island they were bound for. We reefed our sails and threw out our sea anchor, that sack-like drag of canvas that keeps a boat from turning broadside to the wind and waves and from drifting too fast. We lay down for a decent night's sleep. We would need all our energies for the morrow. A sudden shout. I awakened. It was just daybreak. Straight ahead was a wild white line of surf. It broke over a long, low coral reef, and just behind it was a high cliff. We had run into a strong current during the night. Kraus had awakened just in time to see that it had carried us perilously near the reef. The wind was sweeping us toward the breakers. "Raise sail," I shouted. We scrambled frantically and raised the canvas. The wind was inshore. We could not head into it. We were being blown slowly, inexorably on to the reef. People accustomed to the surfs along ordinary coasts have no idea what breakers are like off the islands of the South Pacific. The surf all over the Pacific is particularly strong, but when it breaks over a mid-oceanic coral reef, nothing can live in it. The strongest swimmer is sure to be dashed to pieces against the jagged coral. And there wasn't the slightest hope of our moving against the wind and backing away from the reef. Slowly, slowly, we were nearing it. The breakers roared like thunder. In a few moments, we would be flung into that death trap of water and coral. Pistol in hand, I shouted something to the effect that I didn't intend to be ground to death by the breakers on that jagged coral. The others looked for their pistols. One could not find his. Between the pull of the current and the power of our sails, we were drifting along the reef, edging toward it. The wind gave us an extra push. We were in the backwash, only a few yards away from the breakers. And still, one man could not find his pistol. Instinctively, we all waited. And that was what saved our lives. Suddenly, we saw the reef drop away, slanting back at a sharp angle, and a moment later, we were drifting parallel to the coral. It was then that I discovered there were two kinds of breathing. In times of terrible danger, the breath comes in short, quick puffs. The danger gone, you breathe deeply. By Joe, when we got clear of that reef, I breathed such a breath that it seemed to go right down to my heels. I sat looking at my boys' faces. When we got our pistols ready, their faces had set tense, as if cast from bronze. With the danger past, their faces held the same set expression. It was an hour before their old expressions came back again. Two of my fellows found patches of gray in their hair afterward. Maybe they had been there for years, only to be discovered now. Another's leg was absolutely blue in spots. In those frightful moments he had, without knowing it, grasped his thigh in a clutch like a drowning man. I tell you, by Joe, it was the hand of God that put the curve in that reef. When one of the boys, I don't know which, said in surprise, "We are clear," I knew it was the hand of God. End of chapter 27. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 26 of Count Luckner, the Sea Devil, by Lowell Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28, Caught by the British at Wakaya. The island was Wakaya. Several old sailing ships were in the harbor. We gazed at them with hungry eyes, and eager plans of capturing one ran through our minds. Natives on shore spied us, took us for shipwrecked sailors, and put a boat out to meet us. It suited our plans to let them go right on thinking we had been shipwrecked. That might make it much easier for us to get some information about the vessels at anchor. Leaving a couple of my boys in the boat, the other four of us accompanied the natives to their huts, where they treated us hospitably. They were simple, trusting people. Several half-breeds and a couple of white men, however, looked at us suspiciously. One half-breed was particularly offensive and insisted on asking us many questions. We did not like his behavior at all. Kierheis and I took a walk along a path in the woods to talk over what seemed another menacing situation. A white man came galloping by on horseback. He was pale with excitement. He slowed down for a moment, gazed at us, responded curtly to our greeting, and went on. Thoroughly alarmed, we hurried back to the village. Some curious business was afoot, and we were determined to find out what it was. "Our last half-gallon of rum," Kierheis murmured regretfully. "Yes," I responded, "it is too bad, but it will go to a useful purpose." We got hold of the half-caste who had been so inquisitive. The white man we had seen on horseback was with him. Something indeed was afoot. We talked casually with them and then suggested drinking. They were interested and became enthusiastic when we produced our half-gallon of rum. In the half-breed's hut we staged a drinking bout which lasted half through the night. Nothing like rum to make men friendly and conversational. The half-breed got so conversational that he blurted out, "Why, you're all right, but at first we thought you were Germans. We could get 50 pounds if you were Germans." Now, as an American sailor would say, you've got to hand it to the English. They know how to spend money when it is useful. We Germans are usually more niggardly, or careful, some might call it. We will try to save a mark, and then lose thousands. Having received the wireless warning from the resident at Aitutaki of mysterious armed Germans in the South Seas, the authorities in the Fijis had passed word among the natives to be on the lookout for us, and had offered a $250 reward to anyone who turned in definite information about a party of Germans posing as neutrals. It was clear enough that the half-breed and the white man had been plotting to hand us over to the authorities, but how far they had gone we did not know. We did not find out that night. It was not until later that we learned the white man's horseback ride had been to give a warning about us to the captain of a cutter in the harbor, and that the cutter had at once shoved off to carry the message to the officials on one of the larger islands a day's sail away. Not knowing this, we used a good deal of persuasion to put the idea firmly into the heads of the two men that we could not possibly be Germans. It may have been our eloquence, or, more likely, the genial influence of the rum, but, at any rate, they seemed to lose all of their suspicions and became convinced that we were the truest Norwegians from Scandinavia. Kierheis and I, somewhat the worse from our session at detective work, slept at the Englishman's house. The 4 others were offered quarters ashore for the night, but 2 of my boys remained in the boat as a precaution. It was well they did, too. During the night, native swimmers went out to her and cut the anchor rope. They were put up to it by a Malay police officer who was suspicious of us. Not knowing any of my men would remain on board her, since she was only an open lifeboat, he planned to search her. So he sent his swimmers out to pull her ashore and beach her. The wind was inshore. The anchor rope cut, the boat drifted in. Our 2 men were asleep and only awakened when keel jarred against bottom. Dark figures were around in the water, trying to pull the boat on the beach. Our men, pistol in hand, drove them away, and then pushed out into open water. On the following day, we made our final costly error. The ships in the harbor weighed anchor and raised sail. We picked the one that seemed the newest, and arranged with the skipper to take us along with him to Suva, on the main island Veti Levu. Of course, our plan was simply to sail a few miles out to sea with him, and then take the ship ourselves, after donning our uniforms and getting out all of our weapons. A sudden squall blew up and forced the vessels back to port. We returned with her, and now we should have taken her while she lay at anchor. The people ashore would have seen what was going on, but we could have held up the island and then put to sea, storm or no storm. That was our first impulse. We should have followed it. Always trust your first impulse, at any rate if you go into the pirate business. It is the boldest and best. Instead, we chose a more cautious course. Prudence ceases to be a virtue when you are on an adventure like ours. We had been bold enough heretofore, and I have no satisfactory explanation for our caution now. It may have been that we were not quite ourselves. Our voyage down from the societies and the cooks to Fiji, with those days of hunger, thirst, and scurvy, had sapped our strength and vitality. Perhaps, although we felt quite well, we had not yet got back our full vigor of body and mind. Perhaps we were low on red corpuscles. At any rate, we resolved to wait until the following day and capture our ship when it had got out to sea. While we waited, another vessel arrived. She was a beauty, too, and would have delighted any seaman's eye as she came sailing into the harbor. She had just arrived, we were told, from Suva. She ran regularly among the islands, carrying merchandise to the traders. She was a handsome three-masted schooner with auxiliary motor power, new, clean, and trim, just the kind of ship we wanted. "By Joe," I said to my boys, "there's our ship." We immediately dismissed all idea of the old windjammer we had intended to capture, and devoted ourselves to this new beauty. A council of war was held, after which Kierhuis went to the captain of the vessel, which now had docked, and told him that we were Norwegians who, while making a cruise in a lifeboat, had missed our ship, which was taking coal from Australia to Suva. Could we not take passage with him to Suva instead of on the other slower old craft, so that we could get back to our own ship? We would pay regular rates for the passage. "All right," replied the captain, a jovial, unsuspecting fellow. "Come aboard at 8 o'clock this evening. We sail in the morning." It was our plan again that, once aboard this lovely ship and out at sea, we would suddenly appear in our uniforms and hoist the German flag. We made ready to abandon the lifeboat. Our belongings required careful packing. We put rifles, machine guns, cartridges, and grenades in our canvas bags, wrapped our naval uniforms around these, and then rolled each bundle in a couple of blankets and tied it securely. A casual handling would not reveal the armament inside. Each of us took a pistol in one pocket and a hand grenade in the other. At 8 o'clock we went aboard the schooner. Our maneuvers had been made carefully, and we had attracted no undue notice of the people who were suspicious of us. Aboard, the captain received us hospitably, and as we went around looking over what we expected to make our next prize of war. And a prize she was, just a year out of the shipyard, and beautifully finished in every detail. "Look at the saloon," I muttered to Ludeman as we wandered around. "Think of what meals we will have here. No more hardtack with loose teeth to bite it. And look at those cabins. Won't those bunks be comfortable when it blows and rains? And what a fine big level deck to walk on, so different from the bottom of our lifeboat." The schooner had 2 new motors capable of driving her along at a lively clip. They would enable us to cover a lot of the wide Pacific and run down many a copra-laden clipper. The captain told us he had aboard a miscellaneous cargo of cloth, white shoes, helmets, silk underwear for the wives of planters and traders, silk stockings, and so on. He was provisioned for a cruise of 6 months, and had aboard large stores of preserved fruits and vegetables, and 6,000 pounds of fresh meat. I said to myself, "Just what we want, by Joe." Here was the perfect prize. What would our comrades, marooned back there on Mopelia, say when we turned up with this beautiful schooner in tip-top shape, with powerful motors, well provisioned and all? Already we could hear the lusty cheers as, with the German flag at our mast, we drew up and cast anchor off the coral reef. I looked up at the trim masts and spars, and around at the freshly scrubbed woodwork of the deck, and spoke silently to the schooner, calling her by a new name. "Ho there, Seattle II. You'll like it as an auxiliary cruiser. We'll have a lot of fun together, by Joe." I could hardly wait for her to raise anchor and set sail, but we had counted that brood of mental chickens before they had hatched, by Joe. A steamer slid into port. The skipper of our clipper, who was standing next to me, said he supposed she had brought over the proprietor of the island. The new arrival lowered a boat. In it were a military officer and 4 Indian soldiers. The boat rowed straight toward our ship. We surmised at once that they were coming for us. Having received the message sent by the suspicious half-breed and the white man that there were 6 Germans on the island, the authorities had sent a force of military police to arrest us. There had been some delay in this, as the only available boat on which to send the police was a cattle steamer, the Amra, and she could not raise anchor for some hours. She had arrived now, right in the nick of time, had communicated with the shore, and been informed that we were aboard the schooner. The storm had cleared during the early morning. The palm trees ashore were ablaze with the tropical sunshine. The water under us was of the deep blue that you see only in the South Seas. A brisk, refreshing wind blew from the west. The boat with the officer and 4 soldiers came rowing with long, powerful strokes. The Indians wore puttees and these funny little pants that leave the knees bare. They carried no arms other than bayonets. The officer had a sword and a revolver. We could easily have shot them down with our pistols, or thrown a hand grenade in their boat, or held them up at pistol point when they came aboard. Then we could have captured the ship and sailed away. The steamer would have been powerless in the face of our machine guns. There were mutterings among my men. They were full of fight. We should, they urged, make the capture and get away. I passed an uncomfortable moment of indecision. Our uniforms were packed in our bundles, stowed below. We would have to fight off arrest and take the ship in the guise not of naval officers, but of civilians, and as civilians we would have to raise our weapons against soldiers. That not only went against the grain, but it went against the unwritten laws of the game. There are many sporting traditions that are carefully inculcated in every German naval officer. If we could have fought in our uniforms, it would have been as honorable naval men. In the end, the odds would be all against us, and the chances were at least 100 to 1 that we would be captured before getting back home. If we fought as naval men and were later captured, we would be entitled to the treatment due honorable prisoners of war. If we fought in citizens' clothes, we were nothing more than international bandits, and as such almost sure to hang finally from a yardarm. They say that all is fair in love and war, but this does not alter the fact that there are things you can do that are not playing the game. Of course, each side has its spies, and a spy, if caught, expects no quarter and gets none. But during the War of 1870, and during the late war too, we Germans were most severe with francs-tireurs, civilians who sniped at soldiers. It has been one of our cardinal principles that war must be waged by uniformed soldiers. In the World War, both sides were charged with introducing new methods of warfare that were not in accordance with the ethics of the game. But you will recall that even Allied cargo and passenger ships armed with guns to fire on submarines made it a general rule to carry gun crews of uniformed Marines to handle the guns. No, I said to my men, in the uniforms of our country we can fight. As civilians, we cannot. At any rate, we are not going to drop a bomb down there and kill that poor defenseless police officer and his men in those short pants. There would be neither fun nor glory in that. My officers were with me, and the men also saw the point, but agreed with much reluctance. Certainly, none of us wanted to go to a British prison camp, but there seemed no help for it. It was the 23rd of September, just 2 days short of a month since our departure from Mopalia. The lieutenant and his 4 men in those short pants and bare knees came aboard. Followed by his men, he stepped up to me. "I've got to arrest you," he began decently enough. "Who are you?" "Allow me," I responded, "to introduce myself. I am Count Luckner, commander of the Seattle. These men here are part of my crew." "Are you Count von Luckner?" "Yes." He gazed around, bewildered, frightened, and certainly nonplussed. I imagine I could see his legs shake. Apparently, he was digesting the fact that he and his men were practically unarmed, and the certainty that we must be armed to the teeth. "We have," I continued, "hand grenades and firearms enough to send you and your knee-pants army here to Kingdom Come, and if we were in uniform, you would be our prisoners. However, be that as it may, you have caught us in civilian clothes. But look here." We took our weapons out of our pockets. I had had 2 of our men bring up our bundles. We cut them open and displayed the grenades, pistols, and machine guns. The lieutenant stared, still aghast in spite of my reassuring speech. The soldiers were funny. You could see the goose pimples on the skin below the lower edge of those short pants. They edged to the rail, evidently ready to tumble overboard. The captain of the schooner and his crew now knew what kind of guests they had welcomed aboard. They stood gaping. "I must ask you to stand back a moment, Lieutenant," I exclaimed, "while I destroy my war material. Overboard with it all," I called to my men. Pistols, grenades, and machine guns dropped splashing into the water. "And now, Lieutenant," I saluted, "at your service." "Right ho, Count," he replied. "You men have made a great name for yourselves on your cruise, and now you have played cricket with me. You will receive decent treatment. You have my word as a Briton for that." He emphasized the word Briton. Aboard the Amra, we heard a different tune piped. They had an old black stewardess aboard, a particularly bad-tempered scold. The moment she saw us, her shrewish tongue began to wag. "Just look at those Huns, and look at their muddy boots soiling our clean deck, and then the black men are supposed to scrub it after them. These Huns should be painted black and with tar. I'd rather be black than one of those Germans. Sinking ships with women and children is all they can do. I'd like to get a gun and shoot every one of them." She certainly had been filled right up to her earlobes with this war of frightfulness propaganda, and that old Jezebel knew how to do her bit of spiteful tongue-lashing. A ducking in cold water would have done her no harm. But we were prisoners now, and the berating of an ill-tempered old Melanesian woman was likely to be the smallest of our troubles. I had no doubt as to what our first ordeal was to be. Unless the British had more recent news than we concerning our comrades whom we had left at Mopalia, which was not probable, we would be questioned as to the whereabouts of the Seattle and the remainder of her crew. I told my men that they should give the same reply to all interrogations, namely, that I had bidden them to keep silent, and that I would answer for all. That would prevent us from tripping one another up. We had taken care to throw away any notes or papers we had that gave any hint as to where we had gone ashore in the Society Islands. They could search us as much as they liked, but they would find nothing. One mischance, though, befell us. I was to learn in a few days that one of my comrades had dropped a notebook, which presently was found. In it he had a brief diary of the Seattle's voyage. I questioned the diarist who had kept the unfortunate record, and he told me that his notes about Mopalia were very sketchy. He remembered clearly that he had written we had captured the sailing ship Manila. After that was a single entry: "Landed stores at Mopalia." There his diary broke off. There was no mention of our having sunk the Manila, or of our having lost the Seattle at Mopalia, or taken refuge on the island. "And now," I said to my men as we came in sight of Suva, "you keep your mouths shut, by Joe. Let me do the lying. They've got us, but they must not get the boys back at Mopalia." End of Chapter 28. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 27 of Count Luckner, the Sea Devil, by Lowell Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Jailed in Fiji while the others escaped to Easter Island. Our arrival as prisoners was the event of the year at Suva, the capital city of the Fiji Islands. Our capture was the only warlike happening that had come along in those parts to break the monotony of life in the dreary South Seas. The newspaper got out a lurid special edition, filled with a harrowing account of the capture of the captain and a part of the crew of the desperate raider, the Seattle. It gave the hour when we were expected to reach Suva. So a huge crowd, that is, a huge one as crowds go in Fiji, had gathered at the pier to look us over. A company of infantry lined both sides of the approach to the pier with bayonets fixed. They certainly were a comic opera-looking lot in their hot-weather knee pants. During our march down the street between the gauntlet of bayonets and the crowd behind them, a half-caste fellow, seeing us unarmed and helpless, stepped forward and spat in the face of one of my boys. I jumped out of line and gave him a blow straight from the shoulder that sent him down in a heap. His friends had to carry him away. I had acted on the impulse of the moment and expected to be run through with a bayonet, but the officer in command of the soldiers shouted, "Serves him right. Good for you, Count." Then, addressing himself to the crowd, he added, "These men have done nothing to deserve such treatment." He said it as though he meant it, too. That Englishman was a real fellow, I tell you. We were promptly questioned. Where were the Seattle and the remainder of its crew? Of course, my boys kept mum. I, on the other hand, invented a story about accidentally getting separated from the rest, who were still aboard the Seattle. Where, we didn't know. The story, of course, was not believed. At first, they kept us at the governor's rest house, a fine place with a garden where visiting white people often stopped. Our meals were borne to us by coolies from the local hotel. The temporary commandant of the rest house was a Lieutenant Woodhouse, a fine fellow. After a day or so, he was replaced by a Lieutenant Whitehouse, whom we didn't like so well. He was what the British themselves would call a bit of an ass, you know. Whenever he talked with me, he kept his hand on his pistol. He apparently thought me a sort of ogre, a bad man sent to frighten nice young lieutenants. Presently he came, hand on pistol, and announced, "General Mackenzie wants to see you, all of you." More questions, by Joe, I thought. Appearing before a general was an event of some moment. We felt we had to look worthy of the German Navy. We had our uniforms, which were somewhat faded after the long trip at sea, but we slicked them up as best we could and generally made ourselves as presentable as possible. They loaded us into stinking cattle cars. For a visit to a general? Cool, we thought. They led us to a stone building and ushered us in. It was a jail. "Is this your General Mackenzie?" I sneered at Whitehouse. "You're a fine British officer." He walked away, ashamed himself of the dodge he had used to get us to the jail without the desperate attempts he, in his stupid timidity, expected us to make. But the jail was not so bad. We got our meals from a restaurant. They separated me from my men, which I did not like. Nor was it exactly military ethics to confine prisoners of war in a common calaboose. But the authorities were nervous. They believed the Seattle was lurking somewhere nearby, and they expected our comrades to come raiding ashore and try to rescue us. Of course, they kept on trying to get us to tell them where the Seattle was, but they learned nothing. Lieutenant Whitehouse was still our jailer. Keeping a good hold of his pistol, he came up to me again. He spoke very politely this time. "A Japanese admiral wants to see you, sir." I laughed at him. "First it was General Mackenzie, and now it is the Japanese admiral. What tricks are you up to this time?" "No, really, upon my word, really, Count, the Japanese admiral wants to see you." "By Jove, Lieutenant, I was fool enough to get all slicked up to see your General Mackenzie, but I'll be hanged if I'll budge an inch to see your old Japanese admiral." I didn't know what kind of foolishness it was this time, and intended to protest and stall as long as I could. He went away rather sheepishly. In a few minutes another lieutenant showed up. "There's a Japanese admiral who really does want to see you, Count Luckner, you know," he said. "Oh, since you say so, Lieutenant, it must be so," I replied. I brushed up my uniform and accompanied him through the courtyard to a pier. A splendid cruiser, the Yusuma, lay out there at anchor in the harbor. A boat manned by Japanese sailors was waiting there for me at the landing. Aboard the cruiser, the magnificent deck contrasting with the dingy jail that now was my home, I felt like a man who, long confined in darkness, suddenly walks into sunlight. My feelings changed to those of discomfort as the Admiral welcomed me. He was a grave, courteous little man, clad in an immaculate white uniform. My own uniform had once been white, but in spite of all the washing I had given it, it was now a dingy gray. The gold braid had turned green from the corrosion of the seawater, so I tried to make up in dignity of bearing what I lacked in perfection of dress. He introduced me to his officers. "Here is the man we have chased for 3 months." And then, turning to me, "I am sorry, sir, to meet you in this situation. I would rather it had been in a good square fight." "I should far rather be your prisoner, Admiral," I answered, "than the ignominy of living in this beastly Fiji Island jail." The Japanese had not known of the jail part of it. The officers looked in cold astonishment at the British lieutenant, who was much embarrassed. In the luxurious saloon I was extended gracious, indeed ceremonious hospitality, the hospitality of Japan. The Admiral offered me cigars and cigarettes, and poured out the champagne for me. I took a cigar, but refused the wine. "I am a teetotaler," I said, "a prohibitionist, as the Americans would say." I suspected that I would be questioned about the Seattle, and didn't want my tongue lubricated with champagne. The Admiral placed 3 books before me. The frontispiece of one was the picture of the Emden, of the other a picture of the Mauve. He turned the pages. Both were filled with Japanese writing. The 3rd book was empty. The Admiral placed this book before me and presented me with a pen. "Write something about your cruise," he asked. "In our country, we write about the deeds of the enemies we have met. We tell what they did for their countries, so that it may fill our youth with enthusiasm to do as much for our country. Write down 1 or 2 things that I can use." "Gladly," I replied, and began to write briefly of our experiences while rounding Cape Horn. "Just a question first," interrupted the Admiral. "Did you put to sea from a neutral port, the United States, Argentine, or Chile?" "We sailed from Hamburg," I responded. "We flew the Norwegian flag and were searched for an hour and a half by a British cruiser." "Examined by the British?" "Yes." Those grave Japanese faces lighted up with smiles of exquisite amusement. After I had written my short piece, the Admiral spoke again. "And now, Count, tell me where you have been." "Admiral," I responded, "that is a question I should prefer not to answer right away. First, tell me where you looked for me." He brought out a big chart. A quick glance, and I saw the island of Mopelia. Around it was a faint line in pencil. That told me what I wanted to know. Undoubtedly, they had found the diary my boy had lost, the last entry of which mentioned Mopelia. The Admiral pointed to the Tasman Sea, between Australia and New Zealand. "I was on your trail here, Count, but I lost you near New Zealand." "I am sorry to say, Admiral, that my ship was never within 6,000 miles of those waters." "But," he responded, "the ships you sank in the Pacific were all to or from Australia." "I know, but—" a little judicious hesitation. "But where were you, Count? Tell me." "I cruised back and forth south of the Hawaiian Islands, over the waters where the Australia-San Francisco ships, the eastbound and westbound, pass." There was nothing like the truth. "You are right, Count. I should have thought of it." "I'm glad you didn't," I replied, "or you would have captured me." He dropped the questioning for a while and asked me about the Battle of Jutland, which always seems to interest Japanese naval men tremendously. When I said I had been through the battle, they made me tell them every detail I could remember. They were interested in everything. The Admiral's comment on what I told him was interesting. "Another proof," he exclaimed, "that the smaller fleet was superior per ship to the larger." And now the Admiral came square to the point. "Tell me, Count, where your Seattle is." I was in a tight hole. I must strike a blow for my comrades out there on Mopelia. The elements I had to work upon lay in the fact that the diary which had been found mentioned merely that we had put stores aboard at Mopelia and told of the capture of the Manila, and said nothing of the fact that we had sunk that ship. Then, also, the truth is rarely believed. I proceeded to skate very near the truth. The Seattle, I replied, was lost. How was it lost? We got on a coral reef at Mopelia. We tried our best to get off, put our stores ashore to lighten the ship, but it was no use. What did you do then? We went aboard the Manila. The four-masted schooner Manila? Yes, we captured her and took her along with us. Where is the Manila now? She is waiting for me off Mopelia. My men are having a good vacation on the island until I come back. I say, Count, we Japanese are not such fools. You had the four-master Manila, and you sailed from Mopelia to the Fijis in a small boat. Yes, I replied, there was not room enough for all of us aboard the Manila. The admiral looked at me with a sly oriental smile. Fine, I thought. I had figured out their minds correctly. They had not set straight out from Mopelia, in spite of their knowing that we had landed stores there, because it seemed wildly impossible that I, with my 5 men, had sailed from Mopelia to the Fijis in an open boat. Count, exclaimed the admiral, I will tell you where your crew is. You did not leave a four-masted schooner and sail 2,300 miles in a lifeboat. You sailed here in the Manila, and having got here, you put out in your lifeboat to capture another ship in a nearby harbor. You tell me your crew is at Mopelia, hoping I will get up steam immediately, go hurrying away for a few thousand miles on a wild goose chase, and leave them in peace. The Manila is in these waters. In 4 days your crew will be my prisoners. He respected me too much to think that I would ever give my crew away. He knew I would try to throw him off the scent. His object was to outwit me, to get my story and read between the lines. Very good, Admiral, I thought. Let us see how it will work out. We parted the best of friends. He was an excellent fellow. Our meeting had been one of mutual deceit, with lies that no gentleman would tell in ordinary times. Now they were quite respectable as ruses of war. The ironical thing was that my men, who under the command of Lieutenant Kling were still living like lords at Mopelia, were destined to have much better luck in getting a ship than my little party had had through all our terrible hardships. They caught a wireless message one day telling of our capture. So, fearing that their own whereabouts might soon be discovered, they hastily began to build a boat to sail away in. But, with the materials at their disposal, they were unable to construct anything like a seaworthy craft, capable of carrying that whole crowd. Then Dame Fortune smiled on them. A French square-rigged schooner sighted the island and the wreck of the Seattle. By Joe, exclaimed the captain, we passed here 6 months ago, and there was no wreck here. We may find castaways on the island. It looks as though we may find a good profit, too. You see, a captain gets 1/3 of the value of any wreck, ship, or cargo that he saves. The schooner quickly veered toward the island. It was a Sunday morning. On the island, the men were sitting around, washing clothes, writing diaries, and so on. The chef was shooting snipe for dinner. Then the cry, "Ship ahoy!" Kling took out a lifeboat with a boarding party, the strongest men he had, some of them the champion wrestlers. As they approached the schooner, the captain leaned over the rail and shouted down to them, "Don't row so hard, boys. We will come for you." Our sailors swarmed aboard, pistols out. "Hands up!" The Frenchman recognized the German uniform. "Mon Dieu, des amendes! I turned off my course to save castaways, and I am captured by the Boche! Mon Dieu!" The schooner was not big enough, nor had aboard provisions enough for both the Germans and the prisoners. Kling decided to leave the prisoners, including the crew of the schooner, on the island, where they would be comfortable enough. When he was a week or 2 out, he would send a wireless that would bring ships to their rescue. So the whole of Seattle town was given over to the prisoners, and the schooner sailed away. She was named the Lutece, but my men discovered that she had been the German ship, the Fortuna. She had been seized by the French during the war, so she got her old name back. She was German again, a German auxiliary cruiser, for Kling fully intended to go right on buccaneering. 3 days after the Fortuna sailed, our former prisoners saw a cloud of smoke on the horizon. Steaming at full speed, her funnels belching smoke, the Japanese cruiser Usuma steered to the island. On her bridge, the admiral swore in Japanese. "By Joe, the Count fooled me all right. He told me the truth. There is the wreck, and there are his men. Everything except the Manila. He tricked me with the tale about the Manila." The Japanese found only men of the Allied nations. "Where are the Germans?" "I'm sorry," replied the French captain, "but they sailed away 3 days ago in my ship, the Lutece." The Japanese admiral was thoroughly disgusted at that, but, of course, he took the whole crowd aboard and took them back to the Fijis. It was of no use to go racing about the immense spaces of the Pacific looking for a solitary sailing, square-rigged schooner. Kling's plan was to sail around Horn into the Atlantic, sink a few ships there, and then try to steal through the blockade and get back home. His course took him to Easter Island, a small remote possession of Chile, where there was no wireless station. There he intended to overhaul the ship, which was in bad condition, and take aboard supplies and fresh water. On October 4th, they sighted the island, but while sailing into the harbor, struck an uncharted sunken rock. The Fortuna was old and worm-eaten. The rock crashed right through her planks. The ship pounded and quickly broke up. The men had to swim for it. The lives of some of them, at least, were saved in a curious way, by 2 pigs. These animals we had brought from Germany aboard the Seattle to serve as fresh pork. They soon became pets, however, and we kept them. They were quite companionable and romped around the decks with the men. Kling had them aboard the Fortuna. When the ship sank, the swimmers, including the 2 pigs, found themselves among sharks. These seemed to prefer pork to human flesh. They seized the 2 pigs and began to fight over them among themselves. You bet the men in the water swam as hard as they could. They were quickly picked up by the native canoes that had put out as soon as the wrecking of the ship had been seen from the shore. The cargo of the Fortuna consisted of Parisian fineries, silk stockings and underclothing, handkerchiefs, parasols, tennis shoes, brilliantine, scented soaps, perfumes, and such. It had been destined for the natives of the South Seas, to whom the French bring a truly Parisian elegance. In the breaking up of the ship, many cases filled with these swanky trappings of civilization remained afloat. The natives salvaged them, and pretty soon it seemed as if the whole island had been on a shopping tour through Paris and had visited the women's shops chiefly, or the Galeries Lafayette. Men and women alike arrayed their dusky selves in all manner of silk and lingerie. The population was delighted. Kling and his men were the bringers of this treasure. They graciously told the natives they could have anything they found, and in return they were granted all the hospitality the island could muster. The Chilean governor, an excellent fellow, placed a house at the disposal of the officers, while the sailors were sought after by the natives as guests in their huts. They remained on the island for nearly 2 months, enjoying life and surveying the strange monuments there, huge monoliths that tell of an ancient, forgotten civilization of people who long since have passed into oblivion. On November 25th, a Chilean steamer that made regular trips to the island hove in sight. When it raised steam for its return voyage, our men were aboard. The Chilean authorities on the mainland received them with friendly hospitality, regarding them as shipwrecked sailors and therefore not interning them. They lived as guests of German colonists in Chile from then on until the end of the war. End of Chapter 29. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 28 of Count Luckner, the Sea Devil, by Lowell Thomas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. The escape from New Zealand to the Smoking Isle. The thought of every prisoner is escape. That was what we thought about, by Joe, and what we dreamed about. Occasionally, I'd wake up with a start, dreaming we were still in our small boat and about to be dashed against that coral reef. Usually, my sleep was not troubled with such nightmares, but I often dreamed of getting away, capturing another ship, and continuing our cruise. This did finally come about, but not for many months. No opportunity of escape presented itself during our stay at Suva, which was not long. Kierheis and I were shipped from the Fijis to a little isle off the coast of the North Island of New Zealand, right near the entrance to Auckland Harbour. The other 4 went to the island of Soms, where they had a hard time under a bad camp commander, a Major Mathis. No chance to escape came their way, but with Kierheis and me it was different. We had a highly exciting time, and thus were spared the mental and physical stagnation that is the lot of the average prisoner of war. The public of New Zealand was inflamed against us. When we arrived, there was a great outcry and demand that we be shot. This amazed us, but we discovered the reason a few days later. You see, the inhabitants of these islands thought that we had sunk the big New Zealand passenger steamer Wairuna with all on board. As a matter of fact, we knew nothing of the Wairuna and hadn't even heard of her. Later, it developed that she had been captured by our fast auxiliary cruiser Wolf, sister ship of the Move, and her crew taken aboard as prisoners. But so far as the New Zealanders were concerned, their ship and all on board her had vanished as though swallowed up by the sea. So they were frantic about it, and my boys and myself nearly lost our lives as a result. After carrying out her raid, the Wolf slipped through the blockade again and back into Germany. At the time of our arrival in New Zealand from Fiji, nothing was known of the Wolf, and it was supposed that we had sunk the Wairuna with her passengers and crew. The rage of the public was such that the authorities had to hide us away in their naval barracks at the Devonport torpedo yard, and then transfer us secretly to a prison camp on the island of Matuihi nearby. Meanwhile, the populace clamored for us to be turned over to them so they could lynch us. The little island of Matuihi, a beautiful strip of land, had long been the internment place of many Germans who had been captured when the British seized our possessions in Samoa and in other parts of the South Seas. They were all civilians, from 10 to 70 years of age, traders, plantation owners, and officials. They greeted us with pride and affection, but more particularly with anxiety. They said we were sure to be shot. I laughed at this. By Jove, who wants to kill us? On what grounds could mere prisoners of war be shot down in captivity? I asked. But things looked a little less rosy when, 48 hours later, we were taken by boat to Auckland and then whisked by automobile under cover of night through valley and forest to a freight train pulled up in a wild, remote place. They locked us up in a freight car where there were 2 beds. They told us it was to protect us against the public. The train pulled out and, after an all-night journey, stopped near the outskirts of the city of Wellington, the capital of the islands that comprise New Zealand. Here they put us into another automobile and rushed us to the Danish barracks in Wellington, an old jail, a relic of the terrible days when New Zealand was a convict settlement. A native keeper who led us along a corridor tugged at my coat and pointed into a cell. There were my boys, Ludeman, Kraus, Parmian, and Erdmann. They were in chains. We were all to stand trial together. We spoke to one another for a minute, and then Kierheis and I were led to our cells. On the following day, Kierheis and I were taken aboard an old cruiser in the harbor and ushered into the saloon, where there were about a dozen men who wore black coats and 4-cornered caps with tassels. Our 4 boys were standing in a corner. I was boiling mad. "What's this?" I said. "Is justice becoming ridiculous? Why are we put in jail like this, and some of my boys in chains? Is that for prisoners of war? And what man of you is able to judge of our warfare? You are civilians. Are we to be judged by civilians? I will answer only to naval men." Just then, Sir Hall Thompson, British naval commander in New Zealand waters, came down the stairway. I turned to him. "I am glad to see you, sir. Why are we treated like this? And are prisoners of war to be tried by civilians?" "Count," he replied, "public opinion forces it. The public has demanded that within 3 days of your arrival in this country, you must reveal where you sank the Wairuna and why you sank her without saving a single life, and also where your ship Seattle is." "But I know nothing about the Wairuna," I replied. "I did not sink her. In every single capture that we made, I took the crews aboard my ship, kept them there until we were overcrowded, and then sent them home." "You say you didn't sink the Wairuna?" "No, nor ever even heard of her." "Will you give me your word of honor on this?" "I give it to you now." "Very well, Count, that is good." "But why do you keep my men in chains?" "We want to know where the Seattle is." "I want to tell you, sir, that my men will die before they will say anything. They have orders from me not to talk. If anyone is to tell anything about the Seattle, it is I. You would give your men the same command under the same circumstances, and you would want them to obey as my men are obeying." "You were the one to ask, Count, about information of the Seattle?" "Yes." "Then tell me where she is." "Captain, may I sink deep in the earth if I ever betray my crew. I respect you. I would not put such a question to you if you were my prisoner." "Count," he replied, "your men have set an example to our sailors. I understand and appreciate your attitude. So long as your men show themselves to be disciplined sailors, they will have excellent treatment. And I hope that you yourself will have a pleasant stay with us and find nothing of which to complain. Gentlemen," he addressed the judges, "the court-martial is over." My 4 men were taken back to their island, and Kierheis and I to ours. At Motuihi, things were not so bad. The food was good, and discipline was not too strict. The camp commander, Turner by name, seemed very proud to have a couple of real war prisoners in his charge. He had really excellent cause to be pleased. Now that he had enemy naval officers in his camp, he was raised to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and his force of guards was increased to 80 men. It likewise seemed to add to his dignity that he had among his captives someone whom he could call Count. The principal annoyance now was the strict watch they felt obliged to keep over us to prevent our escape. Headquarters at Auckland had to be telephoned every other hour and told that everything was all right. Colonel Turner was also provided with a fine new motorboat, so that if anything went wrong with the telephone wire, he would still have a means of swift communication with the mainland. "By Jove, what a fine motorboat!" I exclaimed when I saw it. "Maybe we could use it," commented Kierheis. You couldn't blame the authorities for being a bit nervous. They still did not know where the remainder of the Seattle's crew was, and were worried about a possible raid to liberate us. Likewise, Kierheis and I had the idea of escape buzzing furiously in our heads. In fact, the prisoners on Motuihi, before we arrived, had already thought of a jailbreak. They had formed no definite plan, but had gathered materials that might be useful. One had contrived to filch and hide away a number of tools. Another had found a derelict floating mine and taken the fuses from it, and also a large quantity of gun cotton, which he stowed in his mattress. He slept on the gun cotton every night. Another had succeeded in finding charts of the harbor with the location of the minefields. In any plan of flight, I could, by including the men who had collected them, have these materials at my disposal. The motorboat was, of course, the center of all scheming. The idea was to sail away in it with an able-bodied company of prison camp comrades, capture a sailing ship, and go buccaneering again. One of the prisoners, a young fellow, was a motor expert. The camp commander had assigned him to look after the engine of his motorboat. So he was one man whom we would have to have with us. I didn't think there would be much trouble in getting away with a boat. Although there were sentries all over the island, we were sure we could invent some way of outwitting them. We would have to stow the boat with a large amount of supplies. This our motor expert could do while pretending to tinker with the engine. He could hide the material away in the air chambers of the boat. Much more difficult was the job of collecting all the food, weapons, and other equipment. This took a long time, and all the patient maneuvering that is traditional of prisoners and their schemes of escape. First, it was necessary to quiet the uneasiness of the camp commander. He apparently expected me to go breaking out of his camp, breathing fire from my nostrils. The camp doctor was a German Pole, quite intelligent, but of degenerated spirit, who was used by the commandant to spy on the prisoners. He made the friendliest sort of overtures to me, and I, having been told that he was an informer, made it seem as though I were being completely taken in by his smooth ways. Nearly everybody in the camp suffered severely from rheumatism. I was one of the few who had the good luck to escape the malady, but I pretended to get it badly, so badly that I was only able to walk with crutches. The commandant was pleased when he found that I was almost helpless, for how could a cripple attempt an escape? The doctor pretended to try his best to cure my supposed ailment, but gave me a kind of treatment that was designed to make it worse. His hoodwinking was complete when I asked him to help me to get word to my people in Germany to send me £5,000, and promised him part of this in return for his aid. I kept the hypothetical £5,000 dangling before his nose, and his avarice blinded him so much that I was able to make a ready tool of him. My crew for the projected flight consisted of 9 men, 7 of whom were North German Lloyd merchant ship cadets captured by the British in Samoa. When war broke out, they happened to be at the American South Seaport of Pago Pago. Slipping away in a small boat, they got to German Samoa, only to find it in the hands of the New Zealanders. I did my recruiting secretly. The plan of escape was kept from the other prisoners. Always to keep your secret among as few as possible is a good rule, even among prisoners. You never know who is a spy. The fellows I chose were all lively lads, ready for anything. One day, a couple of the prisoners said to me, "Count, let's get up a show for Christmas, a play." Show, play, theater, that was an idea for me. "Certainly I will," I replied. "I often got up shows in the Navy. We will have a theater here at Matuihi that will beat the best in Berlin. But you must leave everything to me. I will direct everything." "All right," they said. I got permission from the commandant to produce the show. In fact, he waxed quite enthusiastic about it. Not only would it give the prisoners something to do, but it would also provide amusement for the jailers. Life on the island was mighty boresome to all of them. In a little while, the prison camp was humming with preparations for the grand spectacle I was going to stage. This was the cover under which my fellows and I prepared all of our equipment for our escape. It deluded the guards, and also fooled the prisoners whom we couldn't take with us. When we wanted material, always apparently innocent things, we asked for it and said it was for the show. When we built anything, it was for the show. We even built a wireless set out of things supposed to be for our grossest Schauspielhaus. We made bombs out of tin cans and the gun cotton that had already been procured. The bombs had fuses that could be lighted from a cigarette. One of my men worked on a farm in the interior of the island and got a lot of dynamite and blasting powder used in blowing up stumps. We stole a couple of pistols from the camp arsenal. We made a fake contrivance which looked like a perfect Lewis or Maxim machine gun, but it worked well enough, and it looked even more formidable. Cadet von Sartowski took odds and ends and made a sextant that afterward took us 50 nautical miles off our course. Pretty fair, considering the circumstances. We had no great trouble in hiding away a considerable supply of food in the air chambers of the motorboat. Of course, I not only had talked of elaborate plans for the supposed theatrical events that I was directing, but I also had the prisoners prepare a lot of bona fide stage props, more even than could be used. These were made up by the rest of the fellows who were not in our plot. Most of the actual material needed for our escape and subsequent raiding cruise had to be fixed up stealthily by the boys who were to make the dash for freedom with me. One midnight, a guard happened to notice 3 of my men busily at work. One was painting a large German flag. Another was making a red pistol holster. The third was sewing a sail out of bed sheets. We intended hoisting a sail on the motorboat in order to conserve fuel if we had to cruise about in that little boat for a long time. The guard reported what he had seen to the commandant. "Oh, it's all right," said Colonel Turner. "It's stuff for the theater." But the next day he came and questioned me. "Look here, Count, I can understand how you might need a flag and a pistol holster for your show, but what about the sail?" "Oh, that's the curtain," I replied. Of all the people I met in New Zealand, there was but one for whom I had a complete contempt. He was a fellow named Hansen, a German by birth and a naturalized New Zealander. In spite of his naturalization, he had been interned. He happened to notice that the motor expert, while supposedly working on the engine of the Pearl, the colonel's boat, had carried something suspicious aboard. Anxious to curry favor with the commandant, he reported that we were acting suspiciously. The commandant was contemptuous of a rat like that in the first place, and then he was utterly infatuated with our theater. He said that whatever we were doing could only be in preparation for our show. Nevertheless, he tried to investigate, but found nothing to confirm what the squealer had told him. After weeks of hard labor, we were ready. At night, we cut the wires connecting the island with the mainland and set up barracks afire. That created the diversion we needed. Everybody, guards and all, flocked to put the blaze out. I was among the foremost and attracted all attention to myself. I seemed to have a passion for fighting fires. My boys were with me. When the excitement was at its highest, we stole away singly and boarded the motorboat. The engine purred, and we were away in the darkness. We were safe from pursuit for a while, anyway. There was no other boat at the island, and Motuihi could not communicate with the mainland. It was only when the wires were repaired, or when the mainland was due to get its next report, that the chase after us could begin. When our escape did become known on the mainland, on that night of December 13th, 1917, every kind of craft available went out to look for us. Private owners took up scouting for us as a sport. Boats chased one another and shot at one another, and one steamer went on the rocks. Finally, a false rumor spread that we had capsized and drowned, and the weary pursuers were glad to accept it as true and return home. We had our difficulties in finding our way in the night through the Hauraki Gulf on which Auckland lies, but at an hour or so past midnight we saw sweeping shafts of light. The authorities at Auckland were looking for us with a searchlight, a ridiculous procedure, but one calculated to impress the population. We steered by the searchlight beams now and picked our way along easily enough. Of course, it would take a separate volume to record all of the details of our work of preparation and our final escape. I am only giving you a description of the high spots. But, by the way, I almost forgot to tell you how we were dressed. We all had New Zealand uniforms. Mine was the most interesting of the lot, and provided material for Australian humorists and cartoonists for many weeks. As the commander of a man-of-war, even of a 12-foot wooden one, with the unwarlike name of Pearl, I absolutely had to have a sword. One of my boys, just an hour before our escape, slipped into the wardrobe of the prison camp commandant. Not only did he take Colonel Turner's best dress uniform, but he also swiped his sword and scabbard. We lay off an isolated bay of Red Mercury Island, northwest of the Bay of Plenty, for 2 days, during which we had a couple of narrow escapes from searching boats. A government cutter had almost sighted us when she damaged her propeller on the rocks and had to limp back home. The 3rd day we put out to sea, and as we bounced about on the waves, I swore in the cadets as regular midshipmen of the Imperial Navy and promoted Vice Corporal von Egedy to the rank of Naval Junior Lieutenant. As commander of a war vessel, even though she was only the colonel's motorboat, I had the authority to do this. Then each helped the other cut his hair short in naval fashion. 2 sailing vessels came by. We decided to seize them both, sink one, and keep the other. We went after the first one, but a sudden puff of wind carried her along at a great rate, and we could not catch her. This was very unfortunate, for she reported our capture of the second boat, which she witnessed. Bombs poised, machine gun pointing, and German flag raised, we swiftly approached the Moa. She hove to. My boys and I clambered on deck. With Colonel Turner's sword in my hand, I ordered the captain and crew herded below. The captain, an excellent old salt, growling, "You're escaped prisoners, eh? Our boys are doing their bit in France, and at home they can't even guard prisoners." The Moa was a fine craft, but as flat as a matchbox. Intended for coastwise trade, she had no keel and drew only 3 feet of water, but she had huge masts. A storm blew up, and we scudded before the wind. The Moa's captain rushed up bristling with excitement. His boat, he protested, was not adapted for sailing on the high sea, much less through a storm. We were risking our lives, he expostulated. We should take down sail. "We are sailing for our lives, by Joe," I responded, and kept all canvas up. The skipper stayed on deck all night and poured out oil to quiet the waves. We went on our watches, undisturbed. Ordinarily, we would have been somewhat worried, but the storm was taking us along swiftly, away from pursuit. The waves began to break over our stern, and the Moa bobbed up and down. She had a deckload of lumber. Overboard with it. We started to work and were ably assisted by a breaker that crashed over us and in an instant swept most of the lumber into the sea. We were towing the motorboat we had taken from the commandant at Motuihi. A wave swamped her, and she tore loose from the tow line and sank. We steered to the Kermadec Islands, an uninhabited group where the New Zealand government keeps a cache of provisions for castaway sailors. Curtis Island, one of the group, came in sight on December 21st. It appeared in a cloud of smoke, a land of volcanoes and geysers. Presently, we spied the sheet iron shed where the provisions were stored. Kierhuis and 4 men landed on the inferno-like coast and in due time returned, their boat loaded deep with provisions. The New Zealand government was kind enough to provide many useful things for shipwrecked sailors and sometimes for escaped prisoners of war. There were tools, oars, sails, fishing tackle, blankets, bacon, butter, lard, canned beef. In short, everything. We had intended to leave our prisoners on Curtis Island, but that den of steam and sulfur fumes seemed unfit for anyone. So we decided to take them on to nearby Macaulay Island, there put them ashore with a supply of provisions, and send a wireless message to summon aid for them. "Smoke to the north, behind island," sang the lookout. 2 men were still on the island. I sent hastily for them. The Moa raised sail and ran before the wind. The steamer was in sight now. She sailed toward us. We changed our course. She, too, changed her course. The skipper of the Moa recognized her as the New Zealand government's cable steamer Iris, an auxiliary cruiser. She had cannon, and we had none. Our goose was cooked. We still tried hopelessly to run away. She gained on us and signaled us to stop. We kept on. A flash, a distant roar, a hissing in the air, a splash in front of us. She was firing on us. "Heave to," I commanded, and we were prisoners once again. The Iris was manned not by naval men, but by a nondescript crowd that put pistols to our backs as we came aboard and searched us to the soles of our shoes. Then these gentry robbed us of our personal possessions. They were wildly jubilant over their victory. I gathered from them that the ship that had escaped us, having brought the news of our capture of the Moa to Auckland, the authorities there had surmised that we must be headed for the cache of supplies at Curtis Island. When we arrived at Auckland, the New Zealanders had their own little victory celebration. Sightseers in all sorts of boats came out to have a look as the Iris, with the Moa in tow, steamed into harbor, the victor of the Battle of the Kermadec. We were jailed at Mount Eden, the local prison of Auckland, as a punishment for our flight. For a calaboose, it was not bad. After 21 days there, we were distributed among various prison camps. Kierhuis and I went to River Island near Lyttelton on the South Island of New Zealand. Even the yard of our prison in Fort Jarvis was a veritable cage. It was screened not only around, but also across the top with lines of barbed wire. The commander of the camp, Major Leeming of Tasmania, was one of the best fellows I have ever met. He, too, felt himself a prisoner here on this lonely island, and soon became our third man at cards, which we played to while away the hours during the long evenings. A drawbridge that had been smashed by a hurricane was being repaired, and we prisoners had access to the water side for a while. In the yard stood a row of empty tar barrels. One of the barrels fell over, and I happened to notice that it was picked up by a small coastwise schooner that often lay at dock farther down the shore. I threw in another barrel. It floated. The boat picked it up. My plan was made. I could arrange one of those barrels so that I could float out in it. I would pick the time when the little schooner was at shore. Then I would get into the barrel and roll myself off the dock. The boat would pick the barrel up. It might seem a bit heavy, but they would think it had tar in it. The barrel, once aboard, its lid would open, and a man armed with a knife would step out like a jack-in-the-box. Thus I would have a boat. I would pick up Kierhuis, who would be waiting, and we would go sailing and perhaps get to some neutral island. I had everything, and waited. Major Leeming had been so kind to me that I did not want to embarrass him by escaping under his command. He, expecting an addition to his family, was to take a furlough. I would do my jailbreaking while he was away. But soon after Major Leeming went on his furlough, Kierhuis and I were ordered back to the prison camp at Motuihi. Of course, there was a new commandant at Motuihi now, a Major Schofield. Most of the prisoners there received us with enthusiasm. Even the treacherous Polish doctor brought me a bottle of champagne, hoping that I would not mention our former little business transaction in which he was to get a percentage of that $25,000. Some of our own countrymen who had spent so many hours learning parts for that theatrical show seemed to hold it against us. But, after all, had I not treated them to a far better melodrama from the life of a sailor? Presently, several fellows came to me and asked if I did not think something could be undertaken. They had already contrived to get a few pistols and build a folding canvas boat. We could not very well go to sea in that. But if we could contrive to station ourselves at some other part of the island, we could wait until a sailing ship came along, put out in our flimsy little craft, and attack her. We consulted with the former governor of German Samoa, Dr. Schultz Erwarth by name, who was a prisoner at Motuihi. He, with his personal servant, a giant fellow, formerly a German baker, was allowed to wander where he pleased on the island. It was his man who hit upon the idea of hiding in the interior of the island by building a cave in the side of a dry riverbed that he had discovered, the cave to be so disguised that searchers would not notice it. We could easily get out of the camp and into the other parts of the island, and, at the same time, give the impression that we had escaped over a cliff to the shore and been picked up by a boat. We could keep to our retreat until the search had died down, and then we could watch for a passing sail ship and attack it. The plan seemed an excellent one. We gathered more weapons, while Dr. Schultz Erwath and his man, on their long rambles, began the construction of the cave. Things progressed rapidly. Then the armistice came. If it had been delayed a week, there would have been another escape at Matuihi. After the armistice, we were prisoners for 4 more months on the North Island near Auckland, but were allowed visitors. One day, a Maori chieftain's wife from the tribe of the Waikotas, a people who made a name for themselves as warriors against the English in their heroic struggle for freedom in 1860-61, called with her retinue. This lady, whose name was Kaihau, handed me a letter. It was written in Maori and translated, read as follows. I come to you, O illustrious chieftain, and pass on to you for the future preservation of an old tradition, the mat of the great chieftain Waitete. As she handed me the letter, she brought forth from under her dress a mat that she had hidden there while passing the prison guard. My surprise was great, and I nudged Kierhuis, but he was as mystified as I. Fortunately, there was a German lady present who had been living in New Zealand for some time. She understood the customs of the handsome Aborigines who once ruled in New Zealand, and explained to me that I was about to receive the highest honor that the Maoris can bestow upon anyone. The chieftain's wife began to dance around me with great rapidity and wild abandon. The name of this dance was the haka haka, or something like that, and at the conclusion of it she presented me with a green stone found only in New Zealand. Again she spoke. O great warrior from across the seas, we greet you as a chieftain of the Waikatos, and among my people you shall be known henceforth as Aitete, meaning holy water. We believe that the spirit of our Maori hero Aitete has returned to us in you. I accepted the stone and pressed the Maori woman's hand to express my gratitude. As she was about to take her departure, she requested that I hide the mat and stone and carry them to Germany with me, which I did. But before concealing them, I had my picture taken wearing nothing but the garb of a Maori chieftain, this simple mat. Except for the absence of full war paint and the usual tattooing, my friend said I made a perfect Aborigine. Perhaps so. Even in Germany there are those who look upon me as more of an Aborigine than a civilized being. When the day on which we were to sail drew near, the president of the Soldiers' Mothers' League visited me and wished me a pleasant trip on behalf of the mothers of 80,000 soldiers. She said she came because New Zealand's sons, who had been war prisoners in Germany, had returned home in good health to their mothers. Therefore, she considered it her duty to pray God that I, too, might soon be restored to my mother's arms. So at last we sailed away from New Zealand, the land down under, where we had had the last of our adventures, enjoyed a few hardships, spent many weary and delightful hours, and met many hospitable and kindly people. On the whole, I have happy memories of the Antipodes. In July of 1919, I stepped on German soil again and hurried home, just in time to pass a few more weeks with my father, who died on September 3rd. The old warrior held steadfast to his faith in the fatherland to the last. But to his dying hour he was filled with regret because his government would not let him take an active part in the Great War. On July 3rd, 1920, all my men returned, that is, all save one. Their clothes were faded from the tropical sun and corroded by the seawater, but they returned without a stain upon either their honor or their loyalty. The only gap in our ranks after those long adventures was the excellent Dr. Peach, our ship surgeon. The news of Germany's collapse reached the remote part of Chile where he was living. When he heard it, he fell dead of heart failure. Returned to my beloved fatherland, I found so many things changed and different from what I had hoped. In this connection, there is one memory always before me. It is of my mother. I was sitting at her sickbed when even the doctors had given up hope. Only then did I realize how much I loved her, but I also realized, with sorrow and regret, how much more I should have done for her. Exactly the same feeling I have today when I find my country lying low. Never have I loved my homeland so much as now. To the youth of America, I would like to send a message. Europe is one continent attached to still another, even greater landmass. That other is the continent of Asia, filled with many strange races, all speaking different languages. Even Europe itself is split up into many nations, speaking more than 30 different tongues. This, I believe, is largely responsible for the constant wars that are the curse of Europe. As an old sailor who has sailed before the mast around this world many times, I want to tell you Americans how lucky you are to live in a great country occupying a large part of this continent, with the wide Atlantic for a barrier on one side and the Pacific on the other. Yours is a great inheritance. You should be proud of it. You should make yourselves worthy of it. As a sailor who has sailed under many flags and whose friends and pals are the citizens of many countries and many climes, it is my dream that one day we shall all speak the same language and have so many common interests that terrible wars will no longer occur. But keep your bodies fit, and if your country needs you, just remember the motto of the sea. Don't jump overboard. Stay with the ship. To all my countrymen, wherever they may be, I would like to say, look up to the bright sun and not into mouse holes where it is dark. Take my lads for your example. When their ship was wrecked on the coral reef of that atoll in the South Seas, there was one thing that was not wrecked: their courage. Even when the Seattle met her fate, from stem to stern went up the cry, taken from an old refrain, "The German oak still stands." Auf Wiedersehen. End of Chapter 30. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. End of Count Luckner, the Sea Devil, by Lowell Thomas.